Good evening and welcome to tonight's live streaming, which will be a performance of Mahler's mighty 7th Symphony, which will be performed by the Siam Sinfonietta Orchestra, conducted by their founder and resident conductor Maestro Somtau. Okay, so let's have a look at Mahler, Gustav Mahler. Well, he was born in 1860 in a small town in what is now the Czech Republic, called Kalisz. There Mahler grew up amongst all the different sounds that a child would take in and register. He was one of a large family, over a dozen children that his parents had, and many of those didn't survive very long. So the first thing to remember about Mahler is that he was constantly being asked to go to funerals of his younger brothers and sisters who died not long after childbirth, but also of other neighbours' families who died similarly. So he became used to the sound of the funeral march, and he became used to living with death. Not far from the Mahler house was the town square in Kalisz, and there the Imperial Habsburg Empire military band would parade. Now remember, the Czech Republic as it's known today at that time was Bohemia and Moravia, and was under the thumb of the Habsburg Empire centred in Vienna. So therefore there had been a lot of upsurges and rebellions against the authority imposed on them by the Habsburg Empire. So the presence of a military band in the town square was not unusual in many of the small villages and towns around that area of the world. So Mahler would hear these sounds, marches, military music, and also when the band, the military band, weren't performing, the square would be used for festivals. So he would also come across the sounds of peasant dancing and merrymaking, and of course travelling musicians would also come and set up impromptu performances in the square. So all of this influenced the young Mahler tremendously. If he walked a little further down the road, he would come to the river, the woods, and then the fields, so that nature was always very, very close to Mahler. And it's no surprise that all these elements, the death marches, the funeral marches, the military sounding marches of the band, the peasants dancing, the sound of the travelling musicians and the sounds of nature all come together in each of Mahler's symphonies somewhere. They're not always there prominently throughout every movement, but they do appear in Mahler, and certainly in this 7th Symphony we're going to hear tonight. Now Mahler was born in 1860. Having lived some time in Kalisz, where he was born, he then moved eventually around learning his trade. He wanted to be a musician. He learned the piano while he was a young boy, and then his travels took him into Hungary, into Austria, what is now Hungary of course, still under the Habsburg Empire, and he became a fairly well-known conductor. He met the great conductor Hans von Bülow, who rated his conducting but not his compositions, because while he was conducting at the Budapest Opera, he wrote his first symphony. Bülow heard it and said, "I think you'd better stick to conducting, my friend, rather than composing." Mahler, though, was a defiant and somewhat arrogant man, and so he decided to ignore that advice and went on composing. So, eventually, having enrolled at the University of Vienna, making friends there, and becoming quite a well-known conductor, he applied for the prestigious post of conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra and the Vienna State Opera, as it's now known, the Vienna Hofoper at that time. And he was successful in 1897. And from then on, we have a history of the most magnificent music being composed in the 2 or 3 months summer break that he would get from conducting the orchestra and from conducting the opera. He didn't stay more than 2.5 or so years with the Vienna Philharmonic. It wasn't a happy relationship at all, and many of the musicians didn't like Mahler as a conductor. There was anti-Semitism on the rise, and Mahler was Jewish by birth, and therefore his Jewishness was seen as a barrier to his musical prowess. And he converted to the Christian religion in 1897. Some cynics would say he did it in order to get the prestigious post in Vienna. Others would say, well, he'd always been interested in different religions and used to go inside Catholic churches when he was travelling around Austria, Germany and Hungary, so it was no surprise when he converted. Whatever, Mahler became the great conductor at the beginning of the 20th century. His works became well known. Some of his symphonies, which he wrote in those 2 months or 3 months in the summer, were now being performed in countries like Germany, Austria, and eventually Holland, Amsterdam. And also his prowess as a conductor had spread far and wide. So he was a relatively famous man. Now the symphony we're going to hear tonight was written in 1904, or at least the sketches exist from 1904. Alma Mahler, his wife, who he married in 1902, just 2 years earlier, said that he, in 1905, returned to his summer compositional hut and did the orchestration on the sketches, on the bare bones, put flesh on the bare bones, if you will, very, very quickly indeed. Gustav had met Alma Mahler at various social engagements in Vienna. He had fallen in love with her, and they had their first daughter at the end of 1902 and their second daughter in June 1904. So I'm making these points because Mahler was now at the height of ecstasy almost. He'd achieved the jewel in the crown, because the Vienna State Opera, the Vienna Hofoper as it was then, was the most prestigious post a musician could aim for in the world. On top of that, he'd married the love of his life. His wife had given birth to 2 joyful children. His performances of the opera had become renowned. Some of his works were now, earlier works were being performed around Europe and to acclaim. So we have here a man who has made a tremendous impact on the world. And then he comes to write his symphonies in the summer. He takes himself off to a place near Klagenfurt in Carinthia, one of the provinces of what is now Austria, to the Wörthersee, a lakeside residence he had. It was a hut, really, nothing more than a shed. And in that shed, with Mahler and the children, he would write his symphonies. He'd already written 6 by this time, so number 7 came and was completed, more or less completed, in 1905, although he was to revise it several times. In fact, the last revision we're aware of was in 1909, 2 years before his death. And its first performance had already taken place in Prague in 1908. So therefore we have a symphony that reflects, in some respects, that great joy and happiness that Mahler must have been feeling, because the world was at his feet as a composer. He still had to be recognized internationally, but nevertheless he had established himself firmly and beyond repute in one of the most important parts of the world, Vienna and the Habsburg Empire. So, Symphony number 7. This was written, as I say, between 1904 and 1905, and at the same time he was writing a series of songs by the poet Friedrich Rooker. The first set was called Songs on the Death of Children, and the second set were just a series of poems that took his fancy. Lovely poems, beautiful settings, but they influenced the symphonic work that he was writing at the same time. And so symphonies number 5, 6 and 7, all written during this period, are sometimes known as the Rooker Symphonies. And in fact, in this book by Michael Kennedy here, he calls them the Rooker period or the Rooker Symphonies. And this is the final one. It's Mahler's most complex symphony. It's the least performed of all his symphonies, and it's the one that sometimes causes audience the greatest perplexity. Now, don't let me put you off, because it's a wonderful work, it's a magnificent work. But it's a work that takes a little patience, maybe a little tolerance, an hour and a half. And I want to explain more about this. Let me tell you about the symphony. It is in 5 movements. Now, 5 movements wasn't unusual. The 5th symphony had been in 5 movements, and so had the 2nd symphony. And the 3rd symphony was in 6 movements. So therefore, we have a symphony that is breaking with the old classical tradition of 4 movements with a minuet. You know, the Haydn, the Carl Disses von Dissersdorf and the Mozarts were writing in that way. It was Beethoven that broke the mould, of course, with his Pastoral Symphony in 5 movements, and then from then on it became almost standard to vary the format of the symphony. And Berlioz, of course, wrote a 5-movement Symphonie Fantastique, and I mention that because that was the centrepiece of one of the final concerts that Mahler gave at the Vienna Philharmonic in 1900. So we appreciate from that Mahler had quite a rapport with Hector Berlioz, the French composer. And when you think of it, a French composer, you know, being performed as the centrepiece of a major concert in Vienna, it's a little strange, but Mahler would insist and get his way because he was that sort of guy. And so a relationship with Berlioz was very strong, and it was to become even stronger later. And I'm saying this again because I think there are elements of that in the symphony, certainly in the first movement. The first movement of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique is about reveries and passions, and this first movement of Mahler's 7th Symphony is exactly that. It opens in the minor key with a long tenor theme that Mahler called nature bursting in. I wouldn't quite agree with that description, but nevertheless it sets the tone. The long introduction is then moves into a much faster rhythm, and the key changes into the major, C major, and we have a series of marches, strong rhythmic sections, and a huge climax towards the end, and then it dies away in a very somber mood. And so in that respect, those reveries, those passions are very similar to the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique first movement. The context, of course, is entirely different, but nevertheless, I think the influence is there. Mahler's 7th Symphony is sometimes called the Nachtmusik Symphony. He, of course, would never have approved of that title, and it started to appear sometime after his death. And the reason for that is that movements number 2 and number 4 are entitled Nachtmusik 1 and Nachtmusik 2. And they are serenades. The first one is almost reminiscent of scenes from Don Giovanni by Mozart, or even The Marriage of Figaro Act 4, where we have moonlight and gentle harmonies, and it is very beautifully composed. And that first of the Nacht music was heard by Schoenberg, who thought it wonderful, and in fact went on later in his life to write a chamber symphony, which in many respects I think has been strongly influenced by this first of those two movements. Separating the two Nacht music movements is a very strange scherzo. The scherzo had replaced the minuet by this time, and we have here a spooky, eerie, kind of shadowy, it's called shadowy in the markings that Mahler made on the score, shadowy piece of music. Erwin Stein, the great musicologist, described it as a child's fear of death, and there are certainly images of flickering firelight and shadows, grotesque shadows. It's a very strange movement, but it's counterbalanced by a very calm and beautiful trio in the centre. Then comes the next Nacht music, a longer piece, nearly 15 minutes or so, and it features the mandolin, the guitar and the harp. Very beautiful. And then the great Mahler enigma arrives, the Rondo Finale. Here we have a piece of music that has divided the critics. Those who don't like this last movement tear it apart, saying it's a hodgepodge of unrelated themes, a blast of noise, and written by somebody who was of a disturbed mind. Those who love it, like myself, because I adore this last movement, I think it's one of the most wonderful pieces Mahler wrote. It is a celebratory triumph, an affirmation of all those things I mentioned earlier. His happiness at having given birth to 2 children, his marriage to Mahler at the height of his career, his operas being praised by the critics, and of course his reputation beginning to spread, plus his establishment as one of the greatest conductors of all time. So that to me is what this movement is about. It doesn't matter that it's a bit of a hodgepodge of themes. We even hear a snatch from Wagner's Die Meistersinger. We even hear a reference to Franz Lehar's Merry Widow. So we do get a real hodgepodge or potpourri of things happening. But it's triumphant and it's affirmative. And I like to think of it as Mahler, who had suffered from anti-Semitism time and time again, giving a 2-finger salute to the mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger, who'd made various anti-Semitic comments in Mahler's presence over a long period of time. I see it as Mahler standing up and saying, wow, you may not like Jewish people, but my God, you've got to listen to this. And listen to it, people have to. I can also imagine, you know, Mahler at the end of the symphony, and he did conduct the first performance in Prague, taking off his glasses, sitting down and smiling broadly and thinking, now, what do you make of that, audience? What do you make of that? Well, we're 120 almost years since that symphony was first performed, and people still don't quite know what to make of it. But I see it as a wonderful, wonderful combined work. And tonight's performance, being played by the Siam Sinfonietta, I am sure will leave you in no doubt that we have a very great piece of music here. The Siam Sinfonietta love playing Mahler, and I'm sure that will come through tonight's performance. I hope you as an audience will enjoy it just as much as I have over the years. And so I wish you good listening tonight, and thank you for your attention.